Good afternoon, everybody. This is Lisa Ulrich, and I am so glad to welcome you to the Digital Innovation and Lifelong Learning Finalists webinar on behalf of our team here today. We are thrilled that you've joined us, and I'm here to introduce you to today's webinar and to introduce you to my lovely colleagues, first and foremost. I'm here in the room. Sorry about that. I'm here in the room with Dr. J.D. LaRocque, our president and CEO, with whom you'll be hearing from in a moment about the big picture of this work, and Teresa Rowland, who runs as our vice president what we call our sector strategies for the adult workforce development that we're doing. Our goal today is to enable you to emerge from this webinar with a really deep understanding of the purpose of our pilots, to look more deeply and to deepen your understanding of what competency-based learning is all about. And you'll hear momentarily how central that is to our concept of the feasibility and opportunity of these pilots. To provide you with an overview of our full application and some suggestions for its successful completion as partnerships. And then to answer your questions. We've actually created two sets of times for questions, one after our spotlight on competency-based learning, and after that at the end as well. Before we plunge into the content, I just want to share a little bit of guidance about this webinar. You're all on mute throughout this webinar, but if you're having any technical trouble during it in terms of hearing or seeing, please email us at dillpilotquestions@comcore.org, and the trustee director of communications, Dan DeMena, will hopefully help us to connect. But the good news is that we are also recording this webinar and we'll upload it this afternoon. If you have questions during the webinar, there's a chat function on the right of your screen for discussion at the end. Today, we'll mostly be focused on answering questions that we consider of broad relevance to the group, but we will try to answer all of the questions that you've posed by the end of the day next Monday. And you'll be able to see those at our website at comcore.org/available-funding, which is going to become, again, the repository of questions that you'll be able to ask subsequently in the next several weeks. As I mentioned, again, we'll be recording this webinar, and we hope it becomes a reference for you and or colleagues of yours who may not have been able to join us. And we'll let you send you an email to know they're being posted. So I have this vision of today as kind of opening the curtain, or in this case, the doors of a very big tent, and sharing with you the wonderful news that you are part of a very diverse and I think promising group of partnerships representing a total of 79 employers, public and private higher education organizations, training providers, and what we call edupreneurs. And part of why we're so excited about this is that, as you'll hear, the very core of this model involves bringing together partnerships from these different sectors to, we feel, realize the actual goals of the digital innovation and lifelong learning partnerships. So we were so heartened to discover the genuine interest of all of you from across the state. So now I want to do, if you can envision yourselves entering the orchestral part of the day with a drum roll, please. You are our finalists. And as you will read here, you have proposed to create these pilots around a total of 16 very varied target occupations that are listed here. And I think what I want to do is suggest to you that we have focused on initial selection process after reviewing your letters of intent by asking ourselves basically the simple questions. Do your projected occupations align with our overarching occupational or criteria? And did we feel like we had you proposed promising concepts for the creation of this new strategy for workforce development? As we look to select the 3 winning pilots, we will want, and we'll discuss more, for you to share much more rigorous proof of the need for this occupation, the unmet demand, and for the creation of new training methodologies, and to also demonstrate the likely feasibility of using competency-based digital or hybrid training to provide new training paths for for incumbent workers for the target occupation. So now I'm very pleased to introduce you to J.D. LaRock, our president and CEO, who's been kind of the visionary and the facilitative leader here to create work with the governor's task force organized by the governor to ask the question, how is it that we can upskill our workforce in order to meet the needs of our economy? And so he's going to provide you some background context, in part because so many of you are new to this, but most importantly, because we want to make sure that as you enter this, you understand that you are really being invited to join a movement. And we hope to give you the context for what that movement is seeking to build and how we created the criteria for those pilots. JD?
Thank you very much, Lisa. And let me begin by just reiterating our enthusiasm for the robust response that we received from all of you. We were really, really delighted to see so many employers and providers and community partners express your interest in these ideas. And we really hope that we can give life to our vision, which is to move beyond the existing spectrum of education and training options that we provide to our learners and workers, and really try to create some breakthrough models for the Commonwealth, benefiting both employers and employees. So as Lisa mentioned, we want to provide some broad background in order to ensure that everyone's on the same page about our goals and how the pilots will work, as well as the common elements that we've built these pilots around, regardless of the specific occupation. Together, you are really pioneers in a movement that we're launching to enhance lifelong learning. So these first pilots have several purposes, with the benefits intended to accrue to employers and employees, and ultimately to help build what we're calling an ecosystem of lifelong learning. First, these pilots are designed to address Massachusetts' acute shortage of healthcare workers. As you know, projections are that demand will exceed supply in Massachusetts by over 43,000 healthcare workers in Massachusetts by 2024. And so by enabling diverse incumbent entry-level workers to receive relevant, affordable training, these pilots will accelerate workers' career pathways and lead to the promotion of wage gains, which is a very important piece of what we hope to achieve here. Second, the pilots will also help employers build internal pipelines and growing occupations in a cost-effective way that retains workers and promotes their development. Finally, we conceive of the pilot participants as pioneers in the development of Massachusetts' capacity to build lifelong learning ecosystem. The pioneers will work closely together as a learning community throughout this project on design and implementation of the pilots. And our goal will be to understand what conditions are necessary to establish successful programs and what impact that participation in these pilots has on the employees and the employers. In other words, we're embarking on a collective experiment to create high-impact, scalable, and sustainable new programs. So let's begin with an overview of the pilot model. The reason we're doing this project is to develop new options and opportunities that don't exist already. Through the support of the Strata Education Network and the Workforce Competitiveness Trust Fund offered by the Commonwealth of Massachusetts, we're aiming to fund 3 pilots to develop and implement new digital or hybrid competency-based programs for entry-level incumbent workers, again, focusing on healthcare because it's a strategic sector for the Commonwealth. We anticipate that employees may come from any of these parts of the healthcare industry: acute care, long-term care, home care, behavioral health, community health, substance use and addiction services. And as you see from the slide Lisa presented earlier, what you've put forward as applications touch on many of those areas. This is part of our big tent approach to try to solve strategic shortages. And as we will detail, the training ought to lead to a micro-credential of relevance in the field or a stackable certification toward an associate's or bachelor's degree. But regardless, it should be built to assess and develop relevant competencies for the chosen occupation. Pilots will be formed by partnerships that include at least 2 employers, a post-secondary education or training organization, and it may include other workforce training organizations as well. And ultimately, we will fund awards up to $200,000 each, coupled with your 30% match, and that will support a program design phase that will include curriculum development, wraparound support planning, and underwrite implementation, including funds to support the first cohort of students moving through the program. Let me touch now on the required elements of each pilot. This list is essentially a synthesis of our primary selection criteria. It reflects the purpose of the pilots as well as design elements that our research and experience and the work of Governor Baker's Commission on Digital Innovation and Lifelong Learning felt were most likely to support the success of these workers going through these programs. So first is need. We want our pilots to address need and prospective demand for training to build career ladders in the chosen occupation. Second, a focus on outcomes. We want these pilots to show promise for building relevant skills and preparing incumbent working students for wage increases and also advancement within the grant period. And let me emphasize again, your capacity to propose a project that has a focus on wage increases for workers is an important design dimension for us. Third, we're looking for coalitions to co-create programs, coalitions of employers and higher education and training institutions and community partners with the following kind of key elements. One, that they involve competency-based learning in some fashion. Second, that they incorporate some level of digital or online format with, for example, asynchronous instruction. Third, that they're short form. Think of what I said earlier about stackability and credential-based programs. Fourth, that they're affordable. Roughly speaking, we envision new programs that are benchmarked to Pell Grant levels. Many of you know that there are live debates at the federal level about opening up Pell Grants to support new and innovative types of short-form training programs. If we can demonstrate to national partners that Massachusetts is in the lead in creating programs of this type, and that you can develop them in ways that are consistent with a cost level that would cohere with Pell Grant level, that would be a real breakthrough for us as a state. So that is a key design element that we're asking you to think about. And then finally, because we know so many workers of the type that we're seeking to help really benefit from wraparound services, we want your pilots to be thoughtful about wraparound support to promote learner success and completion. And then finally, going back to this idea of a lifelong learning ecosystem, we want to fund partnerships where members demonstrate the potential and commitment to contribute to the establishment of an ecosystem of lifelong learning. That means not just doing something that benefits your own institution or some segment of the state, but really informs a broader state partnership conversation about how we can take the 3 pilots that we intend to fund and build something larger and for the long term. With that, let me turn it back to Lisa to take us into the next section of the webinar.
Thank you, JD. What happened here? Yep. Thanks, JD. And I'm now pleased to really give you the opportunity to learn more about one of the core, and I would argue most unique elements of this partnership, namely competency-based education. We intentionally call this a spotlight because I think this is probably the newest aspect of our work to many of you. It was actually honestly new to me as of 7 months ago. But the more I've learned from both our studies and the work that we've done in some of the earlier efforts we've made in some at least one other pilot, the more I'm understanding the critical opportunity that competency-based education has to achieve to meet with employer needs. So it's at the core of our model. It's new to many of you, and we want to share insights now about its benefits, especially from the lens of a student experience, in order to help you think about how to lay the groundwork for your preliminary planning. We're very fortunate to have with us today our colleagues from the American Women's College of Bay Path University, Jeremy Anderson and Maura Devlin, who've been very generous in working to crystallize their experience and insights about competency-based education. They're going to introduce themselves, and then they're going to tell us more about how, sort of, what exactly is competency-based education and how it works from a student and instructional lens. But I just want to begin by appreciating them and showcasing that the involvement of people like Jeremy and Maura and their institutions is really kind of a crystalline example of the sorts of other resources that we hope to bring to the table for those of you who are interested, but especially for our pilots themselves, to provide the kind of technical assistance and guidance that you'll have through our program design. So without further ado, I bring you Maura Devlin and Jeremy Anderson.
So can you move to the next slide? Oh, there we go. Looks like we have control. Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Maura Devlin. I'm the Deputy Chief Learning Officer at the American Women's College at Bay Path University. And as Lisa said, I'm here with Jeremy Anderson. He's the Deputy Chief of Academic and Administrative Technology. And our division of Bay Path, the American Women's Unit, the American Women's College, is really the innovative arm. 6 years ago, we had a $3.5 million federal grant to really help us rethink how we deliver higher ed to adult women who are primarily learning online. And we really represent our entire model. It's really an ecosystem of student learning experiences, instructor development, wraparound supports, and data-driven interventions. And about a quarter of our curriculum is built out in a quasi-competency-based pedagogy. And we really moved to this model in order to meet students' goals and needs, the ultimate goals being, persisting in their studies and completing their degrees, because this is a transparent method that also facilitates personalized learning and provides wraparound advising supports, elements that you'll be building into your work. And our entire model has won a few highly visible awards from the Lumina and Gates Foundations. We're currently engaged in very similar work at forging employer partnerships due to a Strata grant that we received that's focused on our cybersecurity curriculum. And we both present at multiple annual conferences in the academic and academic tech realms. So our goals today will be to introduce you to competency-based education and its benefits, talk about how competency-based learning works for students, especially adult students. And as Lisa said, we'll work in an example. We'll really just describe the core elements of CBE when it comes to designing courses and working with employers and faculty. And then we'll share some preliminary resources for you as you're developing your applications. So competency-based education isn't exactly new. As you can see, it's a resurgent 40-year-old model that really uses learning, not time, as a metric of student success. So in this way, time isn't linked to the course, so the timing of learning doesn't matter. And in that way, a benefit of CBE is that it really does acknowledge past mastery. If an incumbent worker has learned something at work, CBE can honor that, or earlier coursework, or other ways of learning. It really stresses developing and demonstrating competencies derived from relevant skills that your partnerships, your coalitions will be working together to determine, and not necessarily completing traditional credit hours. So in this way, competency education links academic and professional outcomes. And in your pilot projects, it absolutely will, because you'll be working in these partnerships to develop those competencies. It's really a transparent learning process as well. And in that way, it's really an improvement over the traditional transcript that shows, say, a B in algebra, but you don't really know what parts of the course outcomes the students couldn't master. Competency-based makes that really transparent to students, faculty, and employers alike. And students are really able to work at their own personalized pace. They're the ones controlling and dictating the timing of the learning, and they're working to achieve milestones. So students are really able to accelerate, but the model does also allow for instructors to provide personalized learning and support when students are struggling. And now I'll turn it over to Jeremy, and he'll describe the elements of building in competency-based education.
Thanks, Maura. So we thought it would be helpful maybe to contrast the traditional type of program delivery that a lot of institutions use with the type of course design involved in competency-based approaches. In a traditional course, a faculty member probably begins with the creation of a list of outcomes that will go into a syllabus. At the American Women's College, this tends to be somewhere, 5 to 8 course level outcomes that students need to attain. Those outcomes then would drive assessments that students would do along the learning path, and then at the end of the course to show their mastery. Class meetings happen at regularly scheduled intervals, like a Tuesday, Thursday, or Monday, Wednesday type of cadence. And faculty are really designing and delivering the learning experiences that could be anything from lectures, labs, discussions, or case studies during those meetings that all students are expected to attend. So in this mode, really, faculty are actively transmitting information, or they're creating an environment for students to construct their own insights. To earn credits, then, students need to do 2 things, really. First, they need to attend classes. That is part of the federal definition of credit hours, is attending to classwork. And then the second component is completing assessments along the way to demonstrate their learning. A passing grade, then, becomes the target. So anything, depending on your institution, it may be a C or a B, in order to earn credit. Some inherent challenges to this model, though, are first that it tends to be unlikely that all students are participating in every class meeting. Plus, faculty are probably going to struggle to gain insight into what students are doing outside of the class meetings. This can make it very difficult to gauge who's getting it and who's really struggling and on what. In this model, then, students don't necessarily know where they're succeeding, and faculty wouldn't know where to intervene to support the students effectively. It can almost feel like a black box. Additionally, the assessments in this traditional model are not highly transparent, and it may help to maybe talk through an example to see what we mean here. So imagine that in the course, a student's taking a final exam that covers 5 course outcomes. A student earns an 80% on the assessment, whether based on objective scoring or maybe there's a rubric, depending on the type of assessment we're talking about. At the end of that course, that student who earned an 80% gets a B- on the transcript. There's not a lot of insight, though, into what that 20% was that she was missing. It could have been an entire one of the 5 course outcomes that she completely missed, or it could have been parts of each of the other competencies that were part of the course. This makes it really difficult for an employer to interpret then what that B- really means, and the student may not even know what she's able to do and not do. Competency-based really offers a positive contrast in a lot of these cases. Here, there are many more competencies than traditional courses. At the American Women's College, for example, we do about 60 competencies versus 5 to 8 course outcomes, if that helps. Another difference is that students proceed through competencies at their own pace rather than being anchored just to those class meetings. So since students are doing something to demonstrate their mastery at each step of the process, whether it be performance-based or an objective assessment, there's a lot more insight into where exactly the student is succeeding or struggling, and then the faculty member is able to intervene effectively. Similarly, the reliance on mastery as being the bar that students need to attain means that every student who successfully completes a course has in fact mastered every one of those outcomes, where compared to the traditional classroom, they may have missed an entire course outcome. So this has a lot more opportunity to provide transparency to faculty, to students, and to employers about what students are actually able to do when they leave a competency-based program. So if we can go on to the next slide, we can talk a little bit about how these competencies get designed. Great, and this is really a best practice that we would suggest. It's one that we use here at the American Women's College, and it begins with a backwards course design model where you really start with the outcome. In this case, that would be one competency. And let's use a quick example here to kind of talk through what this might be like to really get this idea of granularity when you compare it to a course outcome. So I'm going to use what may seem like a silly example, but I think it's going to resonate with everybody. And just imagine that the outcome that we're after is driving a car legally in the state of Massachusetts. This kind of granularity would really be a course outcome. You go to a course on how to drive a car, and that's part of your driver preparation training. What we're talking about with competencies is getting much more granular, though, with the skills, ability, and knowledge that go into that much larger ability. So in this case, the skills of driving might be starting the car, using the gas and brake pedals, and activating the blinkers. But you would also need to know the knowledge of the rules of the road and the ability to see, and to a lesser extent to hear. So you can imagine how these competencies kind of all roll up together to create the larger outcome of driving a car. For example, you're going to need to know the rules of the road and demonstrate your vision before anybody's going to allow you to get into the car to demonstrate that you can have the skill to drive the car. Once all of the competencies are defined, though, the next step is, in the process, step 2 here that you see, is designing the assessment that's going to allow the student to demonstrate the very granular skills, knowledge, and ability that you've defined at the competency level. In our example of driving, this might be an objective measure of the rules of the road. So a student may have to do a 10-question quiz on those rules. They may have to take a vision test to demonstrate their ability to see, and a road test during which they drive a car successfully. Finally, the last step of this backwards design model is designing the actual content and activities that allow students to practice their competencies along the path until they feel prepared to complete the assessments. So in this case, that may, if we're looking just at the skills part of operating a car, maybe they're working with a model or participating in a simulation, or maybe they're doing a ride along with a driving instructor to observe successful driving. Whatever the case is, that's the practice that the student is doing before she actually takes her driving test. Now, in this whole framework that I've just described, employers can and should play a key role throughout. First, tapping into their expertise for defining the competencies is a really good best practice because they are going to be able to tell you what graduates of your program need to be able to do in the workforce. Turning those into the competencies and then even the assessments, they're going to know exactly how a successful student is going to show that skill, knowledge, or ability set in the job. So asking them how they might design an assessment would be a natural activity in this case. So the involvement of employers should absolutely be a part of this framework. Now, if we go on to the next step, we can maybe drill down a little bit more to see an actual map where we put all of this together. So can we go on to the next slide? Fantastic. So what you see here is a full map leading to a credential, and there are 9 boxes, 3 green, 3 red, orange, 3 blue. Each of those is a competency. What we did was just kind of broke them up into different colors to demonstrate that competencies tend to revolve around themes. For example, if we're talking in the domain that we're all part of, the green could be competencies leading to the milestone of being able to conduct an intake evaluation with a client. The red, orange could all be competencies that go into calculating and administrating dosages, and the blue might represent the competencies needed to fill out medical paperwork, charts, and EMRs so that an agency would get reimbursed for services. Within each competency, though, within each of these 9 boxes, two things are going to happen. The student is going to practice through an activity, or ideally there may be multiple versions of that activity, and then they're also going to complete an assessment, and that will be the demonstration of their learning, or it could be an objective assessment. Once all of these competencies, these 9 competencies are met, then the credential is earned. You're also going to see, though, on the map that we've built in 2 sample milestones. These milestones serve 2 important purposes. First, they are points in time when students and faculty would be expected to interact. And we talked a little bit before about how this is not necessarily a time-driven model. So this would be imposing some time into the model as a real checkpoint for students and faculty to get together to talk about where students are struggling or excelling, and then the faculty member is able to direct the student in the correct path to that credential. Milestones also can be more formal in that they could represent a critical checkpoint along the pathway where a student might learn enough competencies to earn a mini credential. So the example here that we were using of stacking credentials for, in the blue area, medical record keeping, maybe they do those 3 competencies and they earn some kind of certificate specifically around medical records. Which would be a smaller credential than the ultimate credential, which is working with patients all the way from intake to entering medical records. So the pathway that we've laid out here is kind of deceptively linear, though. Remember that a hallmark of competency-based education is that students are going to move through this map as they demonstrate mastery on each competency. So the next slide here, if we advance, shows one student who might come in this case, she's already mastered everything in that green area. So she really knows how to intake patients, maybe because she does this at a job or she took a prior course in this at another institution. Regardless, she's able to enter the course and take that assessment right off the bat and immediately demonstrate mastery. Then the faculty member is going to sit down because the milestone has been met and will guide the student on to the next competencies to learn. Great. Now, that's one student. Again, deceptively linear. Here's another student, though, who comes in and she's actually mastered one activity or one competency from each of the domains, maybe because she has non-professional service experience, or she's taken a course, or she does a piece of this at work. Regardless, in both of these student cases, what we're really talking about is that prior learning assessment. We're acknowledging the fact that learners come to us with a good, strong background in different competencies, and we're giving them the credit right off the bat for that. That's what's going to help accelerate, but it's also going to help be a transparent understanding of where each learner is when they come into the classroom. So the planned milestones, the last thing to say about this, become much more important when you start to think about how different every learner is going to be. Those milestones, when the student sits down with a faculty member to take stock of what has and hasn't been mastered, is really going to be a point in time when the faculty member is going to need to guide the student in the most appropriate pathway for that student's current and future mastery towards that credential. So what Maura's going to do next is take a closer look at a particular student, and hopefully this brings it home.
Great, thanks, Jeremy. So here's Lisette. She's worked in a direct patient care setting for some time, a clinic that serves low-income clients. And through this work, she's learned lots, but certainly not all, to allow her to perform certain functions in a fully professionalized way. But through your CBE program, she hopes to earn the credential needed to move to the next level in her job. But she's grateful for the asynchronous format because, as the mother of young children and a full-time worker, her window of time to study is very early in the morning or very late at night. Even showing up at a community college a couple nights a week is really challenging for her. She's a bit anxious because she doesn't know computers very well and has no post-secondary ed experience. Your online orientation program, though, provides welcoming information and a lot of information that she needs to know to get started. She knows that she'll be working toward 3 milestones: the intake evaluation track, the calculating and administering dosages track, and completing electronic medical records and the right codes for insurance billing track. And she knows that each of of these milestones has a few competencies that she'll need to master along the way. So she opens up her course in your platform, your LMS, and she sees the 3 tracks. She goes right to the competency about ICD-10 codes because she's picked up on some of these at her job. She knows it's a language that she has some emerging understanding of. So she whizzes through these activities and the assessments. She learns more along the way for sure, and she demonstrates mastery on that competency. Her confidence is therefore high enough to try the math-based activities in the dosages track. She hasn't had a math in a while, so she's a bit anxious. But she appreciates that not only are there math problems to do, which resonate from her formal education in the past, but there's also videos that she can watch and rewatch and pause and rewind and etc. She has control over that. So she likes that. However, she still only scores a 52 when she goes to do the assessment. Because of the transparency involved, the instructor also can see her performance here and reaches out proactively to set up some one-on-one tutoring or a phone call that's mutually convenient to provide individualized instruction. And then in the track on performing intake evaluations, she loves that not only there are readings, but there are role play videos that she can watch. But there are also tech instructions for her on how to make her own video. One of the assessments is that she has to do a role play of a intake evaluation, and she needs to demonstrate mastery. So she loves that the tech instructions provided allow her to film and refilm and try again to make sure that she includes everything she needs in that assessment to show that she's mastered everything needed for that competency. And in this way, she really paces the learning herself, but she's supported by her instructor and by other supports along the way. And if we could just slip to the next slide, I'll quickly summarize and then we'll turn to your Q&A. So in thinking about your design projects, you'll really want to be thinking about the team. As you can see, competency-based education is really developed in advance, and especially because a lot of this will be asynchronous in your learning management system or on your platform. So it really does take advantage of the team approach that Jeremy described. As you're defining your competencies, you'll really want the faculty member to be working with the employer. Similarly, on the assessment, faculty, and again, the employer might have some say into what the assessment is like. You'll want to pull in a designer, a course designer, because those folks certainly have a lot of experience in helping design assessments that really align well to the competency. For the content and activity, this is something faculty are used to doing, but they can also partner with instructional designers rather. But then you might have some other experts available to you, such as librarians who can go curate videos and content and readings for you. Maybe you have assessment specialists at your campus who can help you think about these assessments and content and activities. The instruction will primarily come from the faculty. But then, as you heard in our example, the student support strategies might be a partnership between faculty and advisors. In our model, we call them educator coaches, but you might want to think about how to build them into your system. Something that our educator coaches do is they do provide the orientation, and they make sure that the orientation materials are accessible to students even as they begin their work. Materials such as how to navigate in the system, what tech skills and tech tips they might need to know, what is competency-based, how am I going to be graded, things like that. So that's where our educator coaches come in. So as you can see, this is a whole team approach to the design. And I'll pause there because I know we've taken you through an awful lot, and we want to open it to some questions that you might have.
Great. Thank you so much, Maura and Jeremy. This is Teresa Rowland on this end at ComCore. And I would invite folks, if you haven't had a chance yet to submit your questions for Maura and Jeremy, that you can do so right now via the chat. While we're waiting for some questions to come in, I'll start with one from this end is, Maura, Jeremy, can you say a little bit about how you've worked with employers to define the competencies?
Yeah, and we are, as I mentioned, really starting to engage in that work with our strata grant that we have for our cybersecurity program. And again, ours is a full bachelor's degree. One thing we started to do was research into the field and really understanding pathways to jobs in cybersecurity. We have begun engaging with employers, engaging them with a commitment letter, a letter of engagement, and asking them for specific roles that they might be able to take on with us, whether it's reviewing our curriculum. In the example that Jeremy laid out, those green and orange and blue tracks, we've asked them if they'd be willing to vet a very similar type of thing, but for a full bachelor's degree, what our competencies are, what the skills are that we think we're hearing from our research, but does this resonate with what you really want to know and understand? We'd love to have their input when we get to the assessments as we build out new tracks in cybersecurity. Again, with the idea of trying to see if that actually does align with the needs that they have and the competencies and skills and abilities that they need. So those are the ways that we've begun engaging with them. From there, we hope to partner with them on, internships and things like that. But particularly when it comes to the curriculum, we have specifically asked them if they'll review our maps and our competencies.
That's great. Thanks so much. We also had a couple questions around the instructor's role in competency-based education, and wondering if you could talk a little bit about, is this approach more time-intensive for instructors? In terms of their need to have to conduct evaluations and assessments and the proactive engagement. So if you could say a little bit about that, I think folks on the phone would find that helpful.
Sure. It's a great question. It's something that we talked about a lot as we prepared for this webinar, actually. The one thing I'll say is, the first thing I'll say is that the work on the faculty's part is really done well in advance during the design phase, much more so than it is in a traditional show up on Monday and Wednesday afternoons for a face-to-face class where you might be working a week or two out. This way, everything really needs to be developed in advance because students are going to be working at different times and in different ways. When the course is actually running, the role of the faculty moves from center stage, from head of the class, from the sage up on the stage, more to this guide on the side to be reviewing and evaluating the assessments and reaching out, whether that's in partnership with the advisors, who might reach out to support students or directly to students, whatever your model might support. So it moves to the side and monitors and helps support student progress as opposed to directing the students.
Yeah, and the only thing I would add to that is in our model where we've engaged competency-based elements, what we've heard from faculty is that it's comparable time when you're actually instructing in the course, but the time is spent differently. And the way Maura was just describing it, rather than being a delivery mechanism for content and all of the activities, really the instructor is there to be intervening. So you may have 5 students who are all struggling and you need to hop on quick calls with them versus delivering a lecture for 2 hours a week. So the time is still the time for the faculty member, just spent differently.
That's great. Thanks so much. There is a question, and I think this is something that we can also address a little further on from the perspective of ComCore, but for Maura and Jeremy, curious, someone was asking around how do you reconcile a competency-based program against potentially state requirements for seat time-based programs. And I wasn't sure in your world, if you had an example of that and that you had to reconcile that you could share with the folks on the phone.
Sure. Another good question. In our model, we are, as I said, a bachelor degree granting institution. The American Women's College still does follow all of the federal credit hour rules. The seat time, and that's why at the beginning I said it's quasi competency based, where we haven't incorporated as a full CBE program. So we're still following those rules, but when we design our courses that have CBE elements in them, we're still calculating the seat time and all of that, but we're building we're integrating the competencies in our weekly modules. And we consider, in our model anyway, what students are mastering in the competency-based portion of it is relatively low levels of Bloom's taxonomy for folks on the line who may be familiar with that, where students are learning content knowledge. This is where they're, in Jeremy's analogy, this is where they're learning the rules of the road to drive. But every week we still have applied activities, papers, lab assignments that students are writing, other activities that they're doing, discussion board formats that the instructor is facilitating in a more proactive way. So that's how we've incorporated CBE in, but we're still adhering to to all the NECHI's guidelines and federal credit hour and all of that.
That's great. Thanks so much. I'm going to wrap up now. I'll turn it back to Lisa to wrap up this section. And but just as a plug for, we've been getting lots of questions around the application package, which we will take at the end of the webinar. So continue to please submit those. We're monitoring them and keying them up. Lisa?
Wonderful. Thank you so much to Jeremy and to Maura, who did a tremendous amount of work to really think about how to kind of crystallize this explanation. This list here is a list of some resources that we will put up along with a kind of a very brief description on our website so that you can become more, if you want to dive more deeply into any of the elements of this to help to inform yourself, that's great. But what I want to do is also provide what I hope is a combination of inspiration and reassurance to you, which is that we understand that because this strategy of digital and competency-based for healthcare workers is in many cases kind of new in its individual elements, but new certainly in its its fullness. We have intentionally designed the program to begin with a 6-month program design process to enable you to prepare to create your DILL pilots. And as Maura mentioned, this is a very critical element of competency-based design because in some ways you need to kind of emerge with a full curriculum ready for this asynchronous, non-time-bound instruction. So what this slide lists is essentially what you will come out of the 6-month program design process with. We will be creating for the 3 winning pilots what we call a learning community, and estimate that we'll be getting together once a month for a topic-based workshop and very intensive design and development session. We'll also have follow-up, more individualized coaching. And out of that, we will have created the format and the guidance for you to work to, as partners, have a process for identifying relevant competencies and a key strategy for their instruction and assessment and attainment. We'll have created together an outreach plan so that you can ensure that interested students who are your employers can know about and are eager to be vetted in order to participate. We'll work together to use best practices to create a good support structure for these incumbent workers and a process to track their progress. And overarchingly, and this is part of our commitment to strengthen institutional capacity, not solely focus on the pilot, we are committed to enhancing the winning higher ed and training institutions' commitment to, or capacity for effective digital instruction. And last but not least, you will emerge with what we call an implementation plan and a budget that you've developed in collaboration with us for the implementation of this plan. So we actually took questions a bit early, but we will have some time after I move on to a discussion of the application itself for you to ask some of your follow-up questions. So what I want to do very briefly now is to provide an overview of the application and some, I guess, strong suggestions to you about how it is that your teams can approach this work in the next 6 weeks in order to be ready to provide us with something excellent, but most importantly for you to have thought deeply about how it is that you can bring your assets and couple them with your vision for this work. So I just want to reiterate, we have shared the application with everybody. We sent it to all of the lead applicants, lead people. We can put it again on the web just to make sure it's accessible to everyone on the team. But here it is kind of at a high level, the sections that we've created. So once again, the purpose of this is first and foremost to give us the opportunity to really look more deeply into your plans in order to select pilots. But in the process, we want to provide essentially a framework or the matrix for you to do planning, to think about what we call the what and the how of your new pilots, to look and resolve some of the key issues some of you have already raised about feasibility and sustainability, and to start to chart out your next steps, including a work plan that Teresa's going to describe in a moment, and a preliminary budget for your fifth program design phase. Again, we will be providing $50,000 as kind of seed funding, especially, I would argue, for the time that you will need to invest in the instructional design. Again, the deadlines are October 25th. We're giving you a week of extension because we want to make sure you have enough time. And our hoped for notification is December 6th, with the vision that you will then be kind of ready as winning pilots to start working with us on the program design in early January. So I want to just very briefly kind of give you the high level purpose of each of the key elements of the application, except for the attachments, which I think are more kind of self-explanatory and are a little bit more kind of nuts and bolts. So as I go over these, you'll see that we've given you some suggested page links. And in many ways, these also reflect the weighting for our selection criteria. So in a 10-page document, 2 pages of needs assessment might be correlated to like, that's about a 20% weight for needs. So the needs assessment, let's begin. We need to understand from you who's going to benefit, who are the target participants and the target occupation. And why is that needed? Why is there a growing need for people in that occupation? Why hasn't it been filled? And also, why do you need to establish a new program? Is there no other training? You're going to need to do a little bit of research and give us guidance and data that proves that you need to establish a new program. We have said, I want to just mention that we're particularly interested in programs for healthcare workers with clinical roles, namely those who are patient-facing, in part because that is the avenue for digital competency-based. That's probably the newest frontier. So that's not a requirement, but it is kind of a plus point as we try to understand how to fill these great, they're huge needs in this clinical arena. And we're eager to see some applicants, at least, who are interested in pursuing clinical occupations. Secondly, your partner and collaboration, description of your partners and collaborators. We want to understand more about your capacity and your roles, and honestly, like, why are the whole greater than the sum of its parts? What will you together be able to create that you individually might not have? And I just want to underline again that it is a requirement of this design that you have 2 employers and a higher ed or training organization, but you are more than welcome to add additional organizations, even from those who are part of the original letter of intent, if you think that the collaborative will be strengthened by their involvement. Part 3 is the what I call the model design blueprint. And in many ways, this is the core of what the application is seeking to ask you to build. It is where and it's really the area that's kind of the most evolutionarily different from the letter of intent. So we want to have to ask you about outcomes, an overview of the skills that your occupational training will create, what sort of wraparound support you envision creating, how long you think the program will last. Again, I want to underline that because of the length of the grant, we're looking at programs that are a maximum of 18 months, but you might say, wow, we could create the correct training and credentials in 6 months and maybe run a few different cohorts over the course of the program. And also, what sort of institutional arrangements are going to be necessary to approve this? So, for instance, are there senior leaders who are going to need to approve this? Are you going to need to talk to a licensing or a credentialing organization that oversees the occupation? This is work you're going to need to be doing ahead to at least inform us and hopefully get some traction on. Finally, the budget. We are asking you to lay out how you anticipate allocating the $50,000 budget and the required 30% match. As you heard from Maura and Jeremy, competency-based courses need to largely be designed prior to launch. So I want to really urge you to select a lead design team and make sure you've allocated funds for their time during the program design phase. The work plan is something that I'm going to turn over to Teresa to describe in terms of its purpose and the kinds of questions, and we hope that you will resolve through that description.
Great, thanks, Lisa. So work plan is really just that, the work plan of the major activities that you will conduct in the program design phase. We know it's 6 months, and that seems like a lot of time right now, but we all know that that goes very quickly. And while you'll be engaged in activities as a group with Commonwealth Corporation, there also will be independent activities happening at each of the 3 selected partnerships. And so we want to have some sense of how you'll approach that work. If you'll be working with employers to identify the competencies, if you have an internal governance structure that needs to be followed and certain timelines and benchmarks need to be met, if you'll be talking with prospective employees around their interest in participating and their needs, if you're going to be building out support services. So just like hitting on like the major basic activities, just to give us some sense of how you'll approach it. We won't hold you to the exact timeline, but we just want to have some sense of what needs to happen on your end.
Great. Thanks, Teresa. So last 2 parts, the first being the learning goals. We're eager to understand what it is as you think about your broader, your participation in this. What are you more broadly trying to understand or seek to achieve for your institution? This isn't solely, though it's about creating a new course or program. It's also about thinking around a kind of an institutional reform and an effort to be part of this ecosystem. So we're eager to understand, what do you seek to learn, and any thoughts you have about how you're going to contribute to this team of pilots. And last but not least, I want to envision or encourage you to envision that you've won. and you are writing your own press release. So we'd like you as a final act to really synthesize what it is in one page that you would use to pitch your plan, first and foremost to us, but later on we hope to others who would become the recipients of the news that you've won. So this is a great chance to synthesize what it is and to really give us a clear, compelling news and almost like a press release that allows us to feel like, wow, we get it, and we get why you are uniquely qualified to be selected for your pilot. So I want to do one last slide before we turn to some of your questions. And that is to provide you a little bit more guidance about getting started, some of which we've previewed already. We chose the picture of these ebullient children pretty intentionally because although this is going to be a lot of work, we also hope that you begin this process with a kind of enthusiasm about the prospect of being pioneers and really giving new opportunities to your employees and to your institutions. So just 4 kind of key suggestions. The first is obviously to, as a team, to review that application and the DILL Pilot RFQ. Again, we'll put the application up so that all members of the team can review it, but it's critical that you read the context as well as the questions. Secondly, and this is kind of a connected idea, you'll need to work together on this. This is not an application that a fundraiser alone can write. This is an application that is really about a design process. So as you begin, what we imagine will be a series of design and strategic meetings, we really suggest that you identify the key questions and issues that you'll need to resolve, and that you'll work among yourselves as a team to assign roles and responsibilities so that you can come together and coalesce around this proposal and really schedule your collaboration. I know that you're all probably amazing project managers, but I do want to encourage you to think about this next 6 months 6 weeks is valuable time to really do a pretty intensive design process. As Teresa mentioned, the work plan itself is going to ask you to start to think about potential barriers or challenges to selection, but that work can begin now with touchstones to key leaders, decision makers, and others who will help you to think about how it is that you will be able to design and then implement this by the spring, or by next June, excuse me. And then last but not least, the lead applicants should immediately apply to get what's called a certificate of good standing. And that is described in attachment 6. There are some kinds of institutions that are exempted from this, but I do want to just encourage you to get started on that particular effort now, because it takes 4 to 6 weeks to turn that around from the Massachusetts Department of Revenue. So with that, I'm going to turn the floor back over to Teresa, who've been monitoring your questions. And again, she's going to be selecting those that feel like deeply relevant to the group as a whole. And we will, again, follow up and provide our answers to other questions as in the next week. Teresa?
Great. Thanks so much. I'm going to give Lisa a minute to catch her breath and answer a couple questions related to budget. So there's a couple questions around match, and so just wanted to clarify that the 30% match is in addition to the grant award of $200,000. So if you are asking for a grant award of the $200,000, again, this would be a grant proposal. This would be in your budget for implementation. You'll be looking at a $60,000 match, which is 30%. This can come from, it does not have to come from any specific partner. Really, it's the partnership as a whole has to provide this match. It can be in kind, it can be in cash. So if you have any questions about specifically what we're looking for, please let us know. It's not supposed to be difficult. It's supposed to be a sign of commitment. So certainly staff time that you are not billing for would count. Partner time that you're not billing for would count. There was a question around whether how much money there was for the program design planning process, and that is $50,000, and that the planning period would go from January through June. There was a very specific question on the budget instructions, and we can handle some other of those questions offline, but just to reassure you, there was a question around on the budget instructions. It asks you to just record internal salaries on the salary section. That is just the budget instructions. That doesn't mean you can't also include salaries of other partners that do not work at the lead applicant. It just means those salaries have to go on the bottom of the budget under a contracted service. So certainly you can include those type of expenses on your budget. So I think that wraps up some of the budget questions. Feel free to let us know if you have any more once you get through there. I want to turn it over to Lisa, a couple questions around wage increases. I think there were some just general questions, Lisa, around can you go into a little bit more about what we mean by immediate wage increase needs to occur at the completion of the training, and some questions, which I think is true, around this might be a difficult thing for employers to commit to, or this is definitely a commitment for employers. So could you talk a little bit more around the rationale for that?
Sure. And actually, Teresa and I will probably tag team on this. And I want to just say again, in some ways, I think she'll share her expertise. So I want to underline that kind of if there is one bottom line to all of this is that we've set that this must result in a wage increase, because that's the core purpose of this effort, is to benefit these entry-level people so that they are able to have more financial stability and opportunity. In asking for an immediate wage increase after the completion of the program, we envision essentially two possible ways that can happen. The first is that after the training, the people are ready to enter a new target occupation that in fact pays more. The second way this could happen is that they're on a path towards that target occupation, but perhaps it is not yet done. And this is where there's a little bit more of a gray area, but I think what we are doing is suggesting that the employers will need to, in some ways, incentivize or support the fact that they have earned already some micro-credentials and give them a wage increase to reflect that increase in skills. Teresa, let me turn it over to you to make sure see if there's anything you want to add or clarify.
No, Lisa, I think that was great. And, I do agree with the person who asked this question to say this, could be a challenging conversation to have with employers. And so, suggest that you might want to, start having that conversation now to see where there is an intersection with what Lisa was sharing. So thank you for that question.
Next question.
So, Lisa, a couple questions around target population. So for the folks that these partnerships will recruit from. And so one question around, is it possible that they could recruit folks who are in food services or hospitality positions? And then on the other end of the question is, what if there's somebody who has currently has a bachelor's degree and they want to propose to help advance them, get some more specialized training?
I'm going to take the first one first, only. So yes, I think the key is that we are looking to upskill entry-level workers who are presumably in the healthcare field and are currently earning a low wage. But if you feel like you are able to see a group of a cohort of workers who, through their involvement in this, would be able to move into a target occupation of need and higher wage, great. We're looking forward to seeing your creative proposals. In terms of people who already have a bachelor's degree, they are not really our target population. Our target population are people who do not yet have post-secondary training, because we want to, we have limited funds, and the purpose of this and where we want to target those funds, and frankly, target this whole sort of vision of lifelong learning, is on those employees who need further education and don't yet have the college degree that would frankly give them opportunities anyway, that would allow them to have opportunities absent this. So I'd say no to the bachelor's, and Teresa, if I please jump in if you think there's some nuance to this, but certainly yes to healthcare workers or other cohort, or rather food service workers or other cohorts who could be upskilled into other healthcare occupations.
That's great. Thanks, Lisa. Lisa, question around adding partners. So will partnerships be able to add partners? This wasn't specified in the question, but just to elaborate, so could they add partners now than what they previously included in their letter of intent? And can they also add partners during, as they go through the program design phase? Lisa's pointing at me to answer this. So yes, certainly. Please feel free right now as you're writing and filling out the application to think about what other partners make sense to add to your partnership. And also, as we go through program design, you might realize that there's some other partner that's missing that could play a critical role and support your program. And to that end, even during the implementation of the actual program, you might also realize the same. So certainly able to evolve and add partners as you go. I want to take maybe just one other question around match. And I know as you fill out your budgets, you'll probably have a lot of questions around match and just how to fill out the budget. But we're very open to many different types of match. So yes, match can include employee wages. If you're, when you're paying folks to be part of the training program. It can also include partner time. And yes, if you're doing partner time, and you would put that on the contracted services line item. And again, you can always email us and we'll clarify this as you're filling out the budget. I know it's hard to sometimes remembering at this point. I will say, we're looking for match during the program design phase 2. So think about, as you divide up your match, what makes sense, during the program design match versus what would make more sense during implementation. So I'm going to wrap up questions now. These are really great questions. I know you'll probably have a lot more that you can email to us as you move forward. And I'm going to turn it over to Lisa to wrap things up.
Great. Yes, I want to echo Teresa's appreciation and just say to you how grateful and frankly excited we are to see what your proposals are, and to say that the door remains open for your questions. Again, we will post a recording of the webinar. I'm sorry there was some challenges for a few of you for hearing, but you're welcome to go back to that section with Jeremy and Maura. So we'll post that. We'll post the resources that we've shared about competency-based education, and then we will start to publish weekly answers to your questions. We're not in an effort to be completely equitable during this selection process. We will not be answering your questions individually, but we will aggregate them, answer them in groups, and publish them. So we'll answer them all, and it'll be kind of, you might say, wow, I didn't ask that, but boy, is that useful. So I really strongly encourage you to continue to visit this question site and to send questions to DILL Pilot questions at comcore.org. And we will be here, really eager to be a resource to you. And thank you so much for your interest in this path-breaking work. You are already part of, I would say, a new movement. So with that, I will leave you with a wonderful quote that our governor shared. And he, in thinking about the vision behind this work, he shared, "It's possible to create a way for folks to learn that simply hasn't been available historically to people. And depending on how you learn, the speed with which you learn, the language that works for you, and the approach that works for you, the possibilities here get pretty big." He actually then said folks, but And as long as people are willing to think differently about how this all fits together, the opportunities are enormous. So thank you for helping to realize this aspiration. We're already your partners and you are ours, and we look forward to seeing what you've created and to being a resource to you as you work on these exciting applications. Thank you.